Deputies and senators of the National Congress, governors, ministers of the Supreme Court of Justice, ambassadors, and those who accompany us today in this room. We meet here, as established by the national constitution, to communicate the state of our nation to all the Argentine people who need us. Is looking across the length and breadth of the country. Today marks exactly 82 days since we assumed a challenge of leading the nation in what is possibly the most critical economic moment in its history. After more than 100 years of insisting on an impoverishing model and having almost completely forgotten the ideas that made our country great, the last 20 years have been particularly an economic disaster, an orgy of public spending and uncontrolled emissions that resulted in the worst inheritance that no government in Argentine history has ever received. In fact, the twin deficits we inherited reached 17 percentage points of GDP. Many of the economic data of the inheritance we received have been public since day one when we took control of the country. 5 points of fiscal deficit product in the Treasury and 10 points of quasi-fiscal deficit generated by the central bank, adding a total of 15 points of consolidated deficit. A huge debt with importers and multilateral credit organizations that left us on the verge of default. Negative net reserves in the central bank at $11.2 billion. Energy and transportation prices repressed in some cases up to a fifth of their real value. And a dollar with a 200% gap between the official and the parallel. A rampant issuance in the last years of government for 13 points of GDP, added to the more than 15 points of GDP that had been issued during the first 3 years of government. In turn, during the first week of December, retail inflation ran at a rate of 3,700% annually. During the second, it accelerated to 7,500% annually. While, for those who consider these numbers to be a fantasy, the 52% monthly inflation in wholesale implied an annual inflation of 17,000%. Numbers that fit perfectly with the monetary surplus and the issuance potential derived from the remunerated liabilities of the BSRA. I understand that some politicians add with difficulty, unless it is their own. However, the disaster does not end there. As we audit the national public administration and some lingering symptoms of the economic chaos they left us begin to materialize, we learn in greater depth the size of the crisis we inherited. A crisis that is present in all dimensions of society's life. Perhaps the starkest indicator of the inheritance we have received was recently discovered when the data was made public that nearly 60% of Argentines are below the poverty line. However, for some, it seems that poverty appeared overnight. I tell you that the real salary results from the marginal productivity of labor and that this is given by the accumulation of capital. For this reason, the much-mentioned phrase of fighting capital attacks investment produces the capital stock per inhabitant and, as a consequence of that, real wages. This madness to which populism has led us has made the average salary in dollars at the parallel exchange rate, because the price is what it is, to be $300, when in the 90s it had reached the $1,800, which borrowed in today's currency would be $3,000. That is, populism took away 90% of our income, reaching a level of madness where a third of formal workers are poor. This is a heartbreaking fact, which crudely reveals the brutality of the inheritance we have received and the havoc that the famous model of the present state has produced. From being the richest country in the world when we embraced the seat of freedom, to being a country where 6 out of 10 Argentines are poor, while the majority of politicians, like many of you, are rich. To this tragedy of poverty, which has multiplied by 10 in the last 50 years, social debts and deep problems in all dimensions of Argentine life are added as additional problems. A society with record numbers of indigents, and at the same time never in its history distributed as much social assistance as now, where a good part of that assistance functions as war booty for leftist organizations that steal money from those who they claim to defend and attack, against those who produce it. A society with a labor market where the formal private sector is frozen, which, as a result of its rigidity and high labor costs, has not produced a single new job for 12 years, while public employment and informal work are the only that grow. And as if that were not enough, a broken pension system, which has less income every day in proportion to its expenses, and which in the last 10 years incorporated almost 4 million beneficiaries without contributions through moratoriums that are a moral affront for everyone. Those who fulfilled their responsibility throughout their lives. Retirees, victims of this inheritance, continue to be tied to a formula that we wanted to change, because it pulverizes their income in a regime of high inflation due to the last government. And if it were not for the discretionary recomposition of the bonds that we are carrying out, it would have resulted in a loss of up to 40% of its purchasing power. In fact, the recurrent use of compensatory bonuses is a clear example of how poorly designed the formula is, and that it requires urgent modification, so that retirees are not victims of political misdeeds. In terms of security, we find a society abandoned to its fate. Entire cities targeted by drug trafficking. The streets taken over by chaos and disorder. Both generated by leftist organizations in their desire to constantly extort various governments. A chaos that politics fueled in recent years. And yet, it has turned into a disaster. A chaos that politics fueled for its own benefit over the last 20 years. In front of them, security forces mistreated and trampled by previous governments, who tied their hands and prevented them from doing their work, siding with criminals, exemplified in the absurdity of releasing prisoners during the pandemic. With regard to education, a crisis that has been going on for decades, that is increasingly deeper and that has resulted in the fact that today half of the third graders do not understand what they read in Argentina and 70% cannot solve a problem. Basic math problem. This is the current reality of the country with the most Nobel Prize winners in the region, which in its past was a beacon of educational quality. Incipient illiteracy is to our education what inflation is to our economy. At the level of higher education, the creation of universities has become just another political business, and in professorships and teacher training institutes, left-wing, openly anti-capitalist and anti-liberal educational curricula proliferate, in a country in which what is needed is more capitalism and more freedom. In terms of health, a system pushed towards a shortage crisis caused by unrepeatable trade policy. From the previous government, which left doctors, patients, and families without stock of medical supplies of all kinds, and in particular, special medications such as oncology medications. All this in the middle of the farce of the state taking care of you during the pandemic, where if we had done things like a mediocre country, we would have had 30,000 deaths. Really, while we had 130,000 with the enormous pain that that means. This is. They sold us the idea that the state works like insurance, but in real life, when the accident occurs, it disappears. In technical terms, this happens when the bonus is stolen, as can be inferred from a state that does everything very badly. At the defense level, we inherited an army that is underfunded and even discredited by the state itself, without the resources or preparation to face the challenges of a world in constant change and increasingly distant from peace. As if that were not enough, this national debacle is leading us increasingly to irrelevance in the concert of nations, making us incapable of protecting our own territory and forcing us to drag ourselves before the most questioned countries in the world. This is the reality that they left us, who are by right in history one of the most important countries in the world. A country that 120 years ago had one of the three highest GDP per capita in the world and received immigrants from all corners of the planet. Behind all these evils, we find an inoperative, bankrupt national state that cannot even fulfill its basic functions. A state that does everything and does everything wrong, generating damage in every aspect of social life in which it interferes. As Milton Friedman pointed out, nothing good can be expected from a state. According to the father of monetarism, there are four ways to spend. One can spend one's own money on oneself or on third parties, while the same can be done with the money of others. Thus, the best way to spend is your own money on yourself, since you know what you want and how much it cost you to earn it. That is, the benefit is maximized. On the other hand, when you spend your own money on other people, you minimize the cost, while when you spend other people's money on yourself, you fall into waste. Therefore, this follows that there is no worse way to spend than spending other people's money on others, precisely what the state does. That is why there is more state present, greater waste, and less well-being for good Argentines. The situation report of the 114th dependency to the National Public Administration, carried out by SIGEN and the Secretariat of State Transformation, has provided alarming information, among which stands out a debt with an outflow of nearly $3,000 million in goods and services defaults. A state that not only does not control, but what it controls poorly, designed not to fulfill its basic functions, but to generate a kiosk in every place where possible for the benefit of the bureaucrat on duty. Perhaps the insurance case that we have recently seen in the media is the best example of this. A system designed to generate an intermediary between the different state agencies in order to collect returns from each operation. A corrupt system that has generated hundreds of millions of dollars of returns that ended up in the pockets of politicians. That is, perhaps, the best definition we can give of the situation in which we have found the state. A criminal organization designed so that in each permit, in each regulation, in each procedure, and in each operation, there is a bribe for the politician in power. Sorry. 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 This rotten scheme is served by all powers of the state, both the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch, and at all levels, national, provincial, and municipal. Supported by media outlets that live by the official guideline and overstuffed opinion makers who look the other way or who carefully choose who to accuse and who not to. Also supported by pre-vendor businessmen who support this model because the return of paying a bribe is more tempting than the challenge of competing in the market. Also by unionists who give away their workers, deceiving them with supposed benefits while promoting a labor regime that only benefits them. That is, a system that is absolutely morally bankrupt and intrinsically unjust. A system that can only generate poor people and at their expense produces a privileged caste that lives as if they were monarchs, that reaches obscene absurdities of impunity, such as what we saw this week when we learned that a former governor was put behind bars without due process to a citizen for 50 days, merely for the crime of speaking ill of the crown in a private chat. The silence of those who call themselves Republicans offends. In case it wasn't heard by the applause, the silence of those who call themselves Republicans offends. After having seen with my own eyes and in detail the vulgarity of the waste with which politics has become accustomed to living, I confirm once again that it is not about incompetence, that a system that does so much harm to so many people is not a coincidence, the disaster what they had immersed us in. It is a conscious and planned scheme. It is what I call the caste model. There is an intimate relationship between the privileges of politics and the discomfort of common Argentines. It is precisely the economic model of the present state, a regime of high public spending, fiscal deficit, debt and monetary emission, the system that the political caste uses to expropriate wealth from good Argentines and give it to their clients and friends. In this system, what is at the base of the deterioration is widespread in the last 100 years, the construction of a facade, a business protected by lies. This is the lamentable material and spiritual state of our nation. For many years, we have denounced this model before society, and just over 3 months ago, after 100 years of gradual decline and more than a decade of free fall into misery, a silent majority raised its voice. That silent majority that is made up of those who work, those who produce, the rural laborers who get up at 4 in the morning, those who run a business, the self-employed, the informal worker, the young people who cannot find work, and of the housewives who have the enormous task of educating our future generations. A silent majority of those unprotected Argentine citizens who were not invited to sit at the table of power where the course of the country was always defined. That Argentina woke up, went to the polls, and put in the presidency a man who had just arrived in political life, who leads a new political force, which may not have parliamentary majorities, nor mayors, nor governors, but who knows what he has to do. Knows how to do it, and has the conviction to do it. A president who may not have the power of politics, but who has the power of conviction and the support of the millions of Argentines who want real change. Because as the sacred scriptures say in the book of Maccabees and the festivals of Hanukkah are commemorated, victory in war does not depend on the number of soldiers, but on the forces that come from heaven. Subtitles made by the Amara.org community. The people are not only tested on the battlefield or when facing misfortunes, but they are also tested by the amount of truths they are able to endure. He was speaking to the Argentine people in a context with some economic similarities to the current context, that they were going to have to make difficult decisions, similar to the ones I have to make today. During the electoral campaign, we spoke to the Argentine people with the truth for the first time in decades, and the people understood it, accepted it, and elected us. Although there were other candidates who promised the same old solutions, repeating the same conciliatory and deceptive speech as always, For the first time in a long time, society elected the candidate who preferred to tell an uncomfortable truth than a comfortable lie. We proposed to society that the only way to avoid a worse economic catastrophe would be with a brutal and rapid adjustment of public spending. We also proposed to society that the correction of repressed prices and lagging inflation, as a result of the monetary issue, would generate months of very high inflation, and also that cleaning up the destroyed economy that we inherited would involve sacrifice and pain, and it would take us a while to get out of the hole. We signed an electoral contract of effort and sacrifice, because 100 years of decadence cannot be reversed overnight. But at the same time, we assumed a commitment to the Argentines, that the effort was going to be worth it, because doing so was going to allow us to achieve two objectives. First, it would allow us to end inflation forever and advance structural reforms so that Argentina once again becomes a prosperous and thriving country. Second, it would allow us to end the political apartheid regime that has existed in Argentina for decades, a regime in which politicians and their friends are first-class citizens and good Argentines are second-class citizens. Therefore, due to the mandate for change that the people gave us, and with the endorsement of having told the truth and nothing but the truth in the campaign, during our first 82 days in office, we have carried out the most ambitious government program in the world. Which one has memory? On the economic level, we begin by destroying the snake's egg, the fiscal deficit. We have made progress in the deepest reduction in public spending in our history, with a 5-point cut in GDP in just 1 month. We reduced the primary spending of the national state by 40% in real terms, where this result arose from eliminating public works, reducing transfers to the provinces by 98%, reducing ministries by half, firing ghost public employees, eliminating social plans to people who did not need it, end the intermediaries of poverty, and reduce the fleet of cars, counselors, and cell phones to a minimum. That is to say, although there has been liquefaction, there has been much more chainsawing, all for politics. In short, it is an adjustment that has been carried out mainly on the national public sector, and not as it has always been done, increasing taxes and placing all the weight on the private sector. As you may have already heard us say, in the last 123 years, Argentina had a fiscal deficit in 112 of them. The fiscal deficit and the fight against high fiscal pressure are for us the mother of all battles. They are the cause of poverty and stagnation of the last 100 years. After decades of government that squandered the money of taxpayers, Argentina once again has a government that will take care of each of the pesos that, with work and sweat, Argentines pay. Second, we avoided default with the IMF and other multilateral organizations, in which we were going to fall 11 days after taking office. Third, we cut monetary issuance, which is the only proven cause of inflation, and through an ambitious financial program, we moved forward with the cleanup of the central bank's balance sheet. In fact, since we came to government, we have purchased close to $9,000 million in the market, where, despite this issuance, the execution of PUC against the BCRA and the payment of interest on remunerated liabilities, and therefore fiscal adjustment has managed to keep the monetary base constant. That is, for the same monetary base in pesos, today we have 9,000 million additional reserves that cover more than 90% of it. Not only that, the monetary base that during the 21st century has been around 9% of GDP, today only represents 3%. While if it is considered in the broad version, something only feasible in a furious crisis of confidence, it is in line with the historical average. For this reason, in the last month, the price of the parallel dollar has plummeted. The gap with the import dollar corrected by country tax has disappeared, and dollar futures have aligned with the guidelines established by the BCRA. In a context in which bond prices rise, Country risk falls and stocks fly through the roof, despite the attempts of some degenerate prosecutors to sabotage the future of good Argentines. Therefore, in this context, despite the fact that there are still some months of high inflation, it will continue to fall sharply and the exit from the stocks will be increasingly closer. Fourth, we have been able to resolve the problem of importers' debt, which was a sword of Damocles of $42,000 million that hung over the heads of all Argentines. As a consequence of all these economic measures, we reached a surplus, both primary and financial, in our first month in office, which constitutes a global record in the history of modern capitalism. And as if that were not enough, we have taken all these measures solely with the resources of the executive branch, without support of any kind from the rest of the political arc, with honorable exceptions. But our work is not limited only to economics. In security, we have inaugurated a new doctrine of public order that no one dared to implement, even though it was unequivocally the only correct path. First of all, we began to enforce the law, without exceptions. That is why we freed the streets from the scourge of constant stoppages through our public order protocol. In each and every one of the demonstrations that were called in these almost 3 months of government, and that began immediately as soon as we took office, breaking a record in democratic history. In all of them, we maintained order and avoided the indiscriminate blocking of streets through a controlled deployment of security forces. In addition, we are notifying the organizations that call for demonstrations to bear the cost of police operations. Second, we care for the victims and those who care for us. The culture of despising law enforcement and the people who have murdered us in the streets is over with us. In addition, we are notifying the organizations that call for demonstrations to bear the cost of police operations. Second, we care for victims of crime and uplift criminals. For this reason, we are promoting an expansion of the framework of self-defense and the fulfillment of duty so that citizens who protect themselves or police officers who protect citizens do not end up behind bars while criminals walk freely through our streets. Third, we are ruthless in the fight against organized crime. For this reason, through the Bandera operation, we deployed new members of the federal forces in Rosario, and thanks to the prevention work, intentional homicide on public roads was reduced by almost 60% in these 2 months in the areas controlled by the federal forces. That's why we also created a special management system for high-risk prisoners in our prison system. And now more, they will be controlled by a group of crimes to prevent them from continuing to commit crimes since the confinement, a practice that unfortunately has become commonplace in recent times. Regarding social assistance, we committed to ending once and for all the business of poverty managers who used plan intermediation as a collection mechanism and as an extortionate resource to manipulate those who have the least. That is why we carried out an audit process of social plans that showed, as we suspected, that at least 52,000 Empower work plans were improperly assigned to beneficiaries who did not meet the conditions. VIP planners were paid fraudulently without needing it, many of those too while traveling by plane abroad, many with spurious connections in politics, many public employees whose elimination from the registry resulted in an annual saving of 43,000 million pesos. That is why we also implemented line 134 of the Ministry of Security, which helped us expose the perverse mechanism that the picketing organizations use to bring people against their will to the demonstrations, under threat of taking away their plan. We received nearly 80,000 calls that resulted in more than 1,300 judicialized complaints. And we came to discover, thanks to this system of complaints, the darkest side of this phenomenon, a political gang in Chaco that sexually exploited women and arbitrated their social plans. We are ending the extortion of social organizations towards the beneficiaries, and thanks to the security protocol implemented by Minister Patricia Bullrich, we are also ending the daily extortion that social organizations impose on society every time they block a street. We always said, in our government, he who cuts does not get paid. But we have the vocation to protect as much as possible the victims of the impoverishing system that we are trying to change. No Argentine is to blame for the fact that the ineffectiveness and greed of politicians have destroyed their income, much less the most vulnerable. That is why we decided to end the assistance intermediation system and strengthen direct assistance mechanisms. Along these lines, we have doubled the amounts of the universal child allowance, the pregnancy allowance, and the food card. We have also made receiving social assistance compatible with having a salary of up to 1 million pesos so that those who receive a social plan can eventually reintegrate into the world of work. We also absorbed functions that were carried out in an unaudited manner, without registration and without control by social organizations, such as food delivery. Now we know exactly what happens with each bag of food that is distributed. In educational matters, we multiplied school aid by 4 so that families that were affected by drastic increases in this new start of classes can buy the school supplies and materials that their children need. This measure will benefit the families of 7,300,000 children from initial to secondary school. In an Argentina where children do not know how to read and write, we can no longer allow Varadero and his friends to use students as hostages to negotiate budgets. In a country where students do not know how to read and write, we can no longer allow Varadero and his friends to use students as hostages to negotiate budgets. We can no longer allow Varadero and his friends to use the students as hostages to negotiate joint agreements with the provincial governments. Varadero, 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 Varadero. For this reason, we include in the decree of necessity and urgency. Varadero, Varadero, Varadero. Education, 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 education. For this reason, we included education as an essential service in the decree of necessity and urgency, which will take the weapon out of the union's hands and force them to provide at least 70% of the educational service during any strike. Education, education, education. We always said that we asked the people for their vote not to give us power, but to give it back to the Argentines. This crusade begins by reducing the size of the state to its essential minimum and purging it of privileges for politicians and their friends. That is why we went from 18 to 8 ministries to 56 to 54 secretariats, reducing hierarchical public positions by more than 50%. Now that's a chainsaw. Education, education, education. That is why we also canceled official advertising in the media for 1 year, which will result in savings of more than 100,000 billion pesos if we take as a parameter what was spent last year. It is immoral that in a poor country like ours, governments spend people's money to buy the will of journalists. In addition, we eliminated government agencies such as INADI, which in addition to fulfilling the role of thought police, had an annual budget of 2.8 billion pesos to maintain subtracted militants. Along these same lines, we are going to close the TELAN agency, which has been used during the last decades as a Kaiserist propaganda agency. We reduced discretionary transfers to the provinces to a minimum. Resources that have historically been used to guarantee the safety of citizens. And we reduced discretionary transfers to the provinces to a minimum. Resources that historically were used as currency to buy political support. So that you can understand what it is about, we update it to today's value. Last year, the national state spent 5.4 billion pesos on discretionary transfers to the provinces. Both I and my officials travel on commercial flights and not on private planes, as politicians who have a lax conception of what a medical plane is used to are. We are not wars. We are not wars. For this reason, in the coming days, the National Civil Aviation Administration will establish a new regulatory criterion so that no politician or family members of politicians can use private planes except for strictly official matters. Also, since March 1st, no official who travels with a ticket paid for by a public organization can accumulate miles for personal trips, a meaningless privilege that perfectly illustrates the caste model. We also ended with a festival of official vehicles, which anyone used for anything, as if a human resources director needed a driver. All ministries have complied with the mandate to eliminate at least 30% of their fleet. We also eliminated IRAs and non-automatic essence for imports. So we have put an end to discretion and cronyism. Now anyone who wants to import can do so without asking anyone. The era of bribes in exchange for import permits is over. Finally, we also signed a mega decree of necessity and urgency to, for the first time in 3 decades, return freedom to Argentines instead of curtailing it. Included in that decree were 366 articles that eliminate or modify regulations that hindered the economy, complicated people's lives to protect some privilege, or aggravated the problems they were intended to solve. Among these things, I want to highlight we free the choice of social work so that workers are no longer prisoners of the union of their activity and can choose which service provider they prefer. We repealed the disastrous rental law, and exactly what we said happened. The supply of goods on the market doubled from December to February, and consequently, the value in real terms of rentals fell. We also repealed the disastrous supply law, which was a tool that politicians used to extort companies, and we prohibited the power of politics to prohibit exports. We modernized labor legislation to facilitate the hiring of registered employment, something that was fought by the unions. However, all these first achievements represent only the surface of the great changes that we have come to implement in Argentina. To further our mission to end the privileges of politics and its friends, we are sending to Congress a package of anti-caste laws, of which I want to share with you some of its components. We will eliminate retirement privileges for president and vice president. We will force the unions to elect their authorities through free periodic elections supervised by the electoral justice, which will limit the mandates of these authorities to 4 years, establishing a limit of only one possible re-election. The specific collective agreements made in free association by the workers of a company or group of companies will take precedence over the collective agreements of the sector. We are going to put an end to this madness of imposing on people the working conditions defined behind a desk by a man who has not worked for 30 years. People convicted of corruption in the second instance will not be able to run as candidates in national elections. In addition, every former public official with a conviction signs in the second instance for crimes automatically of any benefit he or she has for having been an official. Lele Olale. Lele Olale. Lele Olale. Lele Olale. Lele Olale. Lele Olale. We will drastically reduce the number of contracts for advisors to the nation's deputies and senators. It has been a common practice in politics for the people's representatives to set up SMEs with 30 or 40 advisors each, squandering the resources of the Argentines. Fuelda. The day will be deducted from the salary of state employees who are not going to work due to unemployment, and eliminate. And in turn, we will eliminate public financing of political parties. Each party will have to finance itself with voluntary contributions from donors or its own members. Yee! If they are going to take me out, oh my goodness, reader. All serious economists in the world, except for some lapdogs of Argentine politics, agree that financing the treasury with money issued by the central bank generates inflation. This is not debatable. Financing the treasury with issuance is simply wrong, technically and morally wrong. This is because it generates inflation and because it liquefies the purchasing capacity of all Argentines. And for what? To put money in the hands of politics, who do not use it for anything other than their personal benefit. However, in Argentina, we have done it again and again, and as a result, we are one of the countries that has had the most inflation in modern history. It ends with us. We are going to send a project to Congress to penalize by law the President of the nation, the Minister of Economy, the officials of the central bank, and the deputies and senators who approve a budget that contemplates financing fiscal deficit with monetary emission to end it once and for all. For everything and forever with those unsustainable practices, morally and criminally. And, furthermore, we will propose that said crime be at the level of a crime against humanity, in such a way that it is imprescriptible so that sooner or later they pay the cost of their actions. These are just some of the reforms that have been made in modern history. These are just some of the reforms that we are going to implement. We will move forward, whether through bills, decrees, or modifying regulations in the most ambitious economic regulation process in our history. Because if we do not change this economic model from the roots, Argentina has no future. However, all these measures that we have implemented, as well as the reform projects that we have promoted, have been received with suspicion and distrust by a good part of the Argentine political leadership, if not with open rejection. What happened with the labor chapter of the DNU and with the law of bases and starting points for the freedom of Argentines, which reflected some of the changes in which we want to advance, fully demonstrates this point. A law that has the honor of once again embracing the model of freedom, inspired by the ideas of Alberti and the generation of 37, which comes to free the productive forces of Argentines, to return freedoms, to end privileges in business from the box, was manipulated and rejected by a part of the political class that resists change. Because we should not fool ourselves, because there is an important sector of the political leadership that does not want to abandon the privileges of the old regime. We saw them in the violent demonstrations in front of Congress, in the statements of union members who refused to understand that the Argentina of privileges is over, in the actions of deputies who asked for the vote supporting the change, but who pretended. Not his command while no one was watching. We also saw it in the reparation of the riders' failures, such as Sergio Massa, Pablo Moyano, Juan Grabois, and Maximo Kirchner. Even with the reappearance of former President Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, who has been responsible for one of the worst governments in history. But we also saw it with journalists who, faced with the decision to end the official guidelines, have decided to go out and defend their privileges in a blatant manner, falling into crimes of slander, insults, and depraved lying. We also saw it in governors who only care about securing the cash to be able to continue with the party of public spending, the official guideline, the recitals of artists with high cachet and dubious quality, private planes, and so many other vices to which we politicians have been used to it for decades. Evidently, there are many actors in the country's political and economic establishment who do not want to leave behind the Argentina of failure, some out of fear of change, others because they are the beneficiaries of this old regime. It is important for society to understand that it was the resistance of a large part of politics to renounce their privileges that boycotted the law, as was evident when there were 142 votes rejecting the article eliminating trust funds. During the entire negotiation process for the sanction of the law, a sector of the political class was revealed that does not understand the historical moment or why the people elected us. We did not come to play the mediocre game of politics. We did not come to lend ourselves to the usual give and take, to emulate those politicians who expedite their projects by exchanging favors, positions, and businesses. We did not come to do more of the same. We came to seriously change the country. That is why, rather than approve a project emptied of content, we prefer to withdraw it. We did not negotiate change, and we are going to fulfill the promise we made to society with or without the support of the political leadership. We will do it with the tools that they can provide us, or we will do it only with the legal mechanisms of the executive branch, as we have been doing until now. Because when we encounter an obstacle, we are not going to turn back. We are going to continue accelerating. Exile, 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 exile. Now, the reality is that today we find ourselves facing a turning point. The crisis that we have characterized is much deeper than it is simply material. It is a crisis of horizon, because everything that we Argentines have experienced in the last 100 years has failed. There are no options left. The logical conclusion is that the only possible alternative is to do something diametrically different from what has been done in the past. That's what we are trying to do, go back to the bases, go back to the ideas that made this country great. However, we've encountered unwavering resistance to making any changes. We have found a willingness to build any reform. Any asset of change that implies a sacrifice for the political class has been rejected. Some because they do not understand the seriousness of the situation in which we find ourselves and cling to past traditions that have only produced failures, and others who refuse to lose their privileges, their businesses, or their comfort. This leaves us with two possible scenarios. The first is the path in which we are immersed, the path of confrontation, that of conflict. That is not the path we chose, and we have demonstrated it by attempting to send this honorable Kasab an ambitious bill with the expectation that it would be accompanied. Now, although we did not choose the path of confrontation, we did not escape it either, because we have known from the day we decided to get into politics that fighting this fight was not going to be easy. I want to tell you, however, that if you choose the path of confrontation, you will encounter a very different animal than the one you are used to, because unlike some of those who are here, or those who look at us from their province, politics for us is not an end in itself. We do not live for politics. We do not live for politics. We have no ambition for power. Far from all that, the only thing we have is fate and change. We don't make decisions thinking about our political career. We don't make decisions thinking about our political career. We came to fly the flags of freedom, fully aware that we were going to have to pay the costs of the obscene party that many of you held. Because what moves us is not power for power's sake, but our sacred cause, the defense of the life, freedom, and private property of Argentines. We do not make decisions thinking about our political career. We do not seek or provoke confrontation. We don't want to discuss the past. We come to propose an agenda for the future. Because, as the saying goes, The secret to change is to focus all your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new. We come to put our energy into building the new, but I want to tell everyone who is here and those who are watching us that if what you are looking for is conflict, you will have conflict. Because unlike some of you, WHO, are thinking about your next election or your own interests, we only think about defending the cause and freedom, about rebuilding our nation and providing a future of prosperity to our children at any cost. Freedom, 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 however. Confrontation is not the path we want or the one we choose. There is another possible path, a different path, a path of peace and not confrontation. There is a path of agreement and not conflict. Agreement, yes, not consensus against change. I must be honest in telling you that I don't have too much hope that they will take this path. I think corruption, meanness, and selfishness are too widespread. But while I don't have too much hope, I haven't lost it either. What's more, I want to be proven wrong. I want to challenge you to show that politics can be more than what it is, that we can aspire to be better, to show that despite our differences, we can put the interests of the nation before the miserable electoral interests. For this reason, and with the desire to be wrong and my distrust of many of you, I want to take this opportunity to extend an invitation to you. Today, in the first opening of sessions of our administration, I want to call on both governors and former presidents and leaders of the main political parties to lay down our personal interests and meet on May 25th in the province of Córdoba for the signing of a new social contract called the May Pact, a social contract that establishes the 10 principles of the new Argentine economic order. Let's go. Let's go. Let's go. In this way, I hope that we can leave behind the antinomies of the past, abandon the recipes for failure and return, just as our founding fathers did more than 200 years ago, to embrace the ideas of freedom once and for all. The purpose of this May Pact will be to establish the 10 state policies that the country needs to abandon the path of failure and begin to travel the path to prosperity. Those 10 state policies are 1. The inviolability of private property. 2. The fiscal and negotiable balance. 3. The reduction of public spending at an international level. Historical around 25% of GDP. 4. A tax reform that reduces tax pressure, simplifies the lives of Argentines, and promotes trade. 5. We discuss federal tax sharing and put an end forever to the current extortionate model. 6. A commitment by the provinces to advance the exploitation of the country's natural resources. 7. A modern labor reform that promotes formal work. 8. A pension reform that gives sustainability to the system, respects those who contributed, and allows those who prefer to subscribe to a private retirement system. 9. A structural political reform that modifies the current system and realigns the interests of the representatives and those represented. 10. And finally, the opening of international trade so that Argentina once again becomes a protagonist in the global market. These 10 ideas, which are the basis of the progress of any nation, will be able to establish the conditions for Argentine growth for the next 100 years, so that, once again, Argentina will be a beacon of light for the West. All politics is called to accompany us. We don't care who they are, where they come from, or what ideas they have defended. To show the government's commitment to moving in this direction, I have instructed the Chief of Staff, the Minister of Economy, and the Minister of the Interior to, as a first step before signing the May Pact, convene the governors of all the provinces Argentines to the Casa Rosada to sign a pre-agreement and sanction both a basis law and a fiscal relief package for the provinces. Once both laws have been passed as a sign of goodwill, we will be able to begin working on a common document based on these 10 principles outlined previously, so that on May 25th of this year, gathered and learned, we can begin a new era of glory for our country. Glory, glory, glory. This is the offer that we put on the table. It will be up to you and the rest of the Argentine leadership to know how to take advantage of the opportunity to change history, or on the contrary, to try to continue down this path of decadence on which they have brought us. That day we will see who is sitting at the table, working for the Argentines, and who intends to continue down this path of servitude. I want to be clear about the nature of this call. Our convictions are unalterable. We will put Argentina's fiscal accounts in order with or without the help of the rest of the political leadership. But if the rest of the policy supports, we will do it faster and better, with lower social costs and higher costs for those who live off the system. If the rest of the policy supports, the reforms that we will implement will have a more lasting nature and, consequently, will generate greater insecurity for local and foreign economic actors, which will result in accelerating economic growth, the fall of poverty, and the improvement of well-being. This historic moment is not for everyone. It is not for leaders who speculate politically. They think that governing is a popularity contest. It is not for those who want to maintain their privileges at the expense of a bankrupt country. And it is not for beautiful souls for whom sheets or commas in a text outweigh the will to change. It is for statesmen or women, for patriots, for those who think about history, who are willing to risk everything for the benefit of the nation, because fixing this country requires enormous sacrifices. To the freedom of the citizens, to the freedom of the citizens. We do not govern to be popular. Seeking popularity is bad advice for a leader. It is this compass that pushed the governments of the last 20 years to postpone measures that, although difficult, were also necessary. We don't hear those siren songs. We do not govern to be popular today or tomorrow. We govern for all Argentines, even for Argentines who have not yet been born. So that one day, in 30 years, when Argentina is a world power, future generations will look back and say that it was there, in La Donta, that our beloved province of Córdoba began the path to prosperity. That's why we have a firm hand, because we have a clear direction. That is why we also agree to pay all the political costs to achieve these changes, including political costs that do not correspond to us. Because if the price of fixing this country is being ostracized, you will find me there with pride, because for us there is nothing more sacred than to fight for freedom. I look at Argentina and I see a country with everything to do, a country rich in natural resources, rich in human capital, and with a spirit hungry for prosperity, but locked, confined, and repressed by a model that can only lead to failure. We came to restore freedom to the Argentines because only a free society can progress, only a dynamic society that works, that employs, that trades, that produces, that imports, and that exports without anyone telling it what or how it can prosper. Don't. Only by being a free society can we as a nation take advantage of the natural gifts that God has given us. I look at Argentina today, and I'm certain that with the ideas of freedom as a lighthouse, this country still has everything to return to the path of prosperity. That is why we govern, to once again make Argentina one of the great nations of the world, leader and reference of the region, a productive agricultural, energy, commercial, maritime, and technological power, full of life, voracious to populate the corners of the homeland with the frontier spirit that once characterized us. That is the country I dream of and for which I govern. Let's see what I say. 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 To conclude this message to the governors, the leaders, the different parties of the political system, and the deputies and senators who are present here today, I tell you, you are facing a pivotal moment in Argentine history. It is a race of an unjust system of which the vast majority of society is a victim, or they can leave their particular interests and ideological prejudices aside, collaborate with our mission of change, help us transform the country, and go down to posterity as patriots. If you choose to rise to the occasion and show up in Córdoba to sign the May Pact, both I and the Argentine people will recognize that gesture as an act of humility and courage and a clear sign that we can work together without hard feelings. I ask only one thing from the Argentines: patience and trust. There is still some time before we can perceive the fruit of economic healing and the reforms that we are implementing. What's more, we have not yet seen all the effects of the disaster we are dealing with, but we are convinced that we are on the right path, because for the first time in history, we are attacking the problem for its cause, the fiscal deficit, and not for its symptoms. That's why I ask for your patience and trust. No matter how dark the night is, the sun always rises in the morning. King Solomon asked God for wisdom to distinguish good from evil, courage to choose it, and temperance to stay on that path. I ask the same for myself and for everyone present here. In this way, the 142nd Ordinary Sessions of the Honorable Congress of the Nation are inaugurated. May God bless the Argentines and may the force of heaven be with us.
Muchas gracias y ¡viva la libertad, carajo! ¡Viva la libertad, carajo! ¡Viva la libertad, carajo!
Habiéndose cumplido el objetivo de esta solemne asamblea, queda levantada la misma.
En el marco del 142º periodo de sesiones ordinarias del Honorable Congreso de la Nación, hemos escuchado el tradicional mensaje a todo el país ante la Honorable Asamblea Legislativa desde el recinto de la Honorable Cámara de Diputados del señor Presidente de la Nación, doctor Javier Milei.